Hello everybody. Okay, what I'm going to do, I guess you can see my slides, can you, yes? Okay, good. So I'm going to talk about green growth versus degrowth this morning. And what I want to do is outline the talk is going to be in two parts. The first part is going to be about green growth and the way that green growth is pushed forward as a new economy. The idea of green growth connecting to concepts like natural capital being sold as a solution to climate change, and growth being seen as a solution to climate change, especially as coming out of Paris. So it's an example of the way it's being used there, the green growth agenda, and the way that growth is also, and green growth is being pushed into this whole idea of competition and the need for competition, and how human society is pushed towards this idea that we must compete. And then the second part of the talk, I'll look at a different alternative system, which is where the degrowth aspect comes in. I'll raise questions about who's meant to transform society, so how are we meant to move from the economy we have to a different alternative society, look at the individual and structure, so these two aspects of what needs to change, and raise some issues around what a social, ecological economy might look like. So let's start with the green economy, the way that this is being pushed forwards. This is a kind of typical picture you get about green growth and the new economy. So everything can continue kind of as before in terms of we're going to make lots of money, dollars, yen, euros, whatever, and the whole system is going to continue growing. The UN has heavily pushed the green economy idea and linked it into concepts of economic valuation and the idea of natural capital. So what we see is in UN reports pushing the green economy before the Rio Plus 20 conference, there's these kinds of statements where you see the transition to green economy is talked about, but what underlies this is the idea that we have to think of in terms of goods and services, converting the environment and all aspects of the non-monetized world to fully integrate them, converting them into economic values. So placing a value on ecosystems, services, facilitating investment in ecosystems, and the idea that we need to do this in order to give people rewards for being good stewards of the environment. So the green economy is a new development path, is the way it's described. It's also linked into sustainability principles and also advocated as being connected to ecological economics, something I've worked in for many years, but we'll look at that in a second. Green, because it will use economic models for wealth creation to focus increasingly on the value of ecosystems, goods and services, and natural capital. So what makes it green is wealth, goods and services, and natural capital. And compared to previous development paths, the uniqueness of the green economy is that it can directly turn natural capital into economic value whilst maintaining it and conducting total cost accounting. Now, lying behind this is the whole banking and finance sector. So this is one of the aspects of why it's being pushed so heavily and seen such a strong thing right now. It's the financialization. In this context, we see development equals growth. So the concept of development is equated to economic growth. A range of different bodies pulling together the idea that you can financialize both carbon and carbon markets and biodiversity and really any aspect of the environment. So providing corporations with business opportunities and financiers, hardwiring biodiversity and ecosystems into finance. The carbon market is continually being pushed as a multi-billion-dollar area for finance, but also the things like offsetting the wetlands credits in the markets. Even in 2010 was already over 1.1 to 1.8 billion in turnover in the US. So billions of dollars being made in financial markets in turnover, and then banking and finance making money out of this. And the idea here is to show politicians how they can get economic growth. You can maintain the nature as capital, get jobs, get economic development, get economic opportunities, and by investing and treating the whole thing as an investment opportunity, pro-biodiversity investment, the logical choice. And this is the thing that came out of both the UN Finance Initiative, but also this TEED project, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity. So green growth is basically a capital idea. The idea is that you invest in the environment and it grows money for you. You get money growing out of the environment. So if you think about this, where the economics has come in a very negative way, I would say, is this kind of a picture where the world is treated as capital. You convert everything in the world to capital. So we have, human interactions become social capital. Investment in human education becomes human capital. Investment in nature becomes natural capital. And investment in capital becomes capital. So the whole world is now capital. And lying behind that capital approach is the idea that goes back into mainstream economics with Nobel laureates and various other people like Stiglitz and Solow supporting this idea, which is the standard economic argument that even in the absence of any technological progress, exhaustible resources do not pose a fundamental problem if reproducible man-made capital is sufficiently substitutable for natural capital. So the key of converting everything into capital forms is to make them substitutable. So if you take a standard environmental resource economics textbook, you get this very clearly. We can pass on less environment so long as we offset this loss by increasing the stock of roads and machinery or other man-made physical capital. Alternatively, we can have fewer roads and factories so long as we compensate by having more wetlands or mixed woodlands or more education. So basically you can destroy the environment as long as you educate people. Or you can have more roads and machinery and destroy the environment. It all compensates, it doesn't matter, right? Everything is commensurable. All values are equated and everything can be substituted for everything else. That's the capital approach. So this is then being pushed, and of course we just had the Paris meeting, and this is a report that came out a year ago, which was a heavy lobbying exercise to basically see human climate change and the solution to it as totally compatible with maintaining the growth economy. What this idea lies behind this is that the low-carbon green growth kind of economy, the push for this, which is now going to accelerate tremendously with the latest change, is that we can actually see this as an economic growth opportunity. The green economy will price things, market them, and push all of these externalities, as the mainstream economists call it, it will push those into a new green and growing economy. So greenhouse gas emissions, for example, greenhouse gas reductions are seen as a new opportunity for increasing growth rates. Stern has already been, in 2006, was pushing the idea of carbon markets and the billions of dollars to be made about in those markets. And behind this is this myth, the myth that disaster prevention is a good way to increase growth and economic prosperity. So basically, the more pollution we have, the more fucked up the world gets, the better it will be for economic growth, because we'll have to spend more and more on cleaning the mess up. And that's a really good thing, right? So intermediate goods and defensive expenditures has been long recognised, going back to Hirsch's social limits to growth. This is not a good thing. It's basic economics, right? This is a waste of money. The worse the world gets, the more we have to spend on defensive expenditures to maintain our well-being and standards of living, the worse we are off. But the way it's being described right now is that this is great because we're going to have more investment and going to get higher rates of return. More pollution, the better off we are. So this is what lies behind this Better Growth, Better Climate report, which is being pushed by a very powerful lobby group. This was a report that came out just in time before the last COP meeting, COP20. So it's a political elite, 2 mayors, 5 ex-heads of state, 2 now working for the UN, 13 financiers and bankers, 4 leaders of world international organisations, the World Bank, International Energy Agency, the OECD, and the unions in there, the international trade unions. And 1 Professor Lord Stern, a very important economist, who has been lobbying heavily for this and is the lead figure. Lord Stern also, behind this report, has an economic elite advisory panel that he set up. 13 men and 2 women, 9 professors, including Nobel Prize winners, and 6 other financiers and economic experts. This is an elite panel of finance and banking people who are heavily lobbying through their connections, through ex-heads of states and so on, to actually achieve what was achieved in Paris, which is the green economy. And what's the idea here? Climate change is good. Climate change is a good thing because we're going to get growth out of it. Tackling climate change is the pro-growth strategy. That was Stern's report in 2006. And it's pro-growth, not just going to help the poor countries, but growth of the rich countries can continue. So the latest report, the 2014 report from this panel, the New Economy panel, continues this line of thinking. We can have growth at all levels of income. That means the richest nations continue to grow. The opportunity to build lasting economic growth is what's on the agenda here, while addressing that risk thing with climate change. Remember that. Competitive markets are vital in this. So the whole point is about creating competitive markets in order to push the growth economy. And Lord Stern has been very clear when this report came out. He was interviewed in the UK press, and he made this comment, what I call Lord Stern's pissing contest. What Lord Stern says is, don't you dare criticise economic growth. And this is what he said to the press. To those who want to knock out growth from objectives, I find they're close to reprehensible. I think to say that we should just switch off growth is to miss big aspects of what matters about poverty. And so it worries me. It's also politically very naive. If you turn it into a pissing contest between growth on the one hand and climate and environment on the other one, and say you've got to choose, you're setting yourself up for failure. This is a very strong message to people to not question growth. So we must have growth to address poverty and improve human well-being. And to oppose growth is reprehensible, naive, and doomed to fail. That's what he's telling us. And another aspect of this then is the green growth and the connection to the competitive spirit. Let's look at what goes on in the European Union. Europe has a roadmap, the Europe 2020 strategy, for smart, sustainable and inclusive growth. That's what we're told. If you look at that document, what you'll find is in 30 pages, 38 references to competition and 14 to greening. And the basic message here is more competitive economy, to compete globally, to compete from developed and emerging economies. Right? The competition coming from developed and emerging economies is intensifying. We have to do something about this. The competitive economy needs to exploit Europe's leadership in the race. So Europe's in a race, it has to compete, it must win the race. We must improve our competitiveness, not just against the emerging and developing economies, but also versus our main trading partners. We need markets, we need competition, we need growth, we need innovation. And this is all for resource efficiency, a sustainable industrial base. So the whole idea of the inclusive growth, the smart and sustainable future for Europe, is actually to outcompete everybody. And what about these main trading partners? So is Germany going to be leading in Europe, and Germany is going to outcompete France, and France is going to outcompete Spain, and Spain is going to outcompete Italy, and Italy is going to outcompete Greece. And this is the kind of future that is being envisioned here. Competition, competition, competition. And we should remember that competition is actually about a leadership race. This is a statement from the CEO of Deutsche Bank. Make no mistake, a new world order is emerging. The race for leadership has already begun. For the winners, the rewards are clear. Innovation and investment in clean energy technology will stimulate green growth. It will create jobs. It will bring greater energy independence and national security. Now, there's no mistake in this statement about what's being linked here. Winning, jobs, growth, independence and security, national security. And make no mistakes, where there are winners, there will be losers. You can't have everybody winning a race. And we should remember what lies behind that national security claim, the linking between the idea of a technological competitive economy and what it's supposed to be offering us. It's meant to be offering security, a stable society, well-being and good jobs. But when you look at what the kind of jobs we get in a future growing technologically driven society, they're ones that have these kinds of pictures of dehumanized workers, people working in mass factory conditions in modern production with tedious repetitive tasks, performing under dehumanized conditions of total control. That's the factory system. And we shouldn't forget that this is directly linked in, our growing and technological economy, to military, to the military expenditure, to production, and to the way that the modern economy is tied into the military-industrial complex. So it's not really surprising that this kind of picture is the way that the world really looks. Massive military expenditures are going on in order to secure resources and supply chains. This is what requires for the competitive growth economy. Somebody is going to benefit, and the people who benefit at the top are the ones who are going to have to secure the supply chains and make sure the world is secure, nationally secure future for them. Look at these countries, the United States, massive absolute military expenditure, but then you can see Turkey in there, 2.4% of its GDP going into expenditures in terms of military and security. And places like Saudi Arabia, like the oil nations, 10.4% of its GDP going into army, military, public order and safety. So the competitive growth society is the thing that we have today, and this is where we're headed, and we're going to have more of it, called green. Readily available, highly concentrated minerals and energy we know are limited. So fossil fuel energy use is set to become increasingly dirty. We've already got this. So we've got fracking and brown coal, which is why they're pushing carbon capture and storage, for example. Also, nuclear power is now going to be heavily pushed, and it's dangerous and dirty. Minerals extraction will increasingly produce more waste for the same usable materials because we're going into lower and lower grades, venturing into valued land, into sensitive landscapes and into ecosystems. So the competition for energy supplies and natural resources is already become a matter of national security. We see this intervention into other countries to secure resource supplies for the growth economies. So our competitive future that is being described by the Europeans and at the UN level and so on is about land grabbing, resource wars, pressurising states to act outside international treaties, violation of human rights and so on, and increasing unilateralism. Again, the climate change negotiations are a classic example with this, with their index, independent targets. So what about a different social, ecological, economic system? What we can see, I think, is a variety of utopian positions that are being set up. And traditional type of approaches are not usually regarded as utopian, but they're totally utopian, these kind of growth economies. Capitalism, neoliberalism, welfare economy, sustainable development, bioeconomy, green economy. All of these are based on capital accumulating system. They shift costs onto other people as a part of their internal operation. They're about individualism and high technology. So all of these things are saying that we can have a growth economy in a finite world. Then there's another set of alternatives. The alternative, which I call scientific or concrete utopias, these should, I think, be based upon scientific understanding, and I mean appropriate technologies here, but also an understanding of biophysical and social reality, that we have an understanding of the way the world is and the way it's structured, rather than these pretend economics that we get in the traditional approaches, where you ignore power and social relationships and military and so on and so forth. So we need to bring in things like eco-social ethics here. So under the second group of what are called utopian visions is degrowth, basic income, communitarianism, eco-socialism, the stationary and steady state, a whole range of alternative approaches which are complementary. So then we have to ask the question, if we're going to make that transition between those two worlds, who will transform society? Typically, the answer to that question is you. The choice is yours. this is what we're told, right? This is the way that the whole classic liberal position is set up. And the classic liberal position is the one that is embedded in Western society and Western culture. The individual is the power in society. So it's also supported in things like neoclassical economics, that you have the choice in the market, and if you move into the marketplace, then it's neoliberalism. And it pretends that the individual has full volitional control over what they can do. I mean, what this basically says is, the reason that the world is a mess today is your fault. You don't buy the right products and make the right choices. So it's nobody else's fault but the individual. Of course, this ignores power and structure in society. So if we look at what happens when you start challenging, when you start trying to change things and get a greener world, you challenge vested interest groups and how they would like us to see the world. And this is the same whether you're a natural scientist, think you're being objective, or you're a campaigner. What happens when you do scientific research that exposes the failures of the system is that you're exposing the failure of materialism to provide a meaningful life. You're undercutting the core of a modern political economy. And this is the same modern political economy whether it's in American neoliberalism or Chinese central planning. The scientific evidence for human impacts on the environment is a critique of powerful vested interest groups. So things like climate change is a threat to the fossil fuel multinationals, the car and the plane industries. And revealing the political and economic exploitation of people and nations challenges those countries and corporations that have been built on the exploitation of the weak. So there is a strong confrontation with the structure of the system. So degrowth is one movement which is actually challenging this whole structure, but not just the structure, also it's a challenge to the individual, to the agent. So both the agent and the structure are being asked to challenge themselves and challenge the structures. I just quickly say what degrowth is not, just to clarify, and maybe you guys don't have these illusions, but some people do have illusions about what degrowth is. Degrowth is not a recession or an economic depression, right? It's a way to change the system. It's not a matter of collapsing the system or stopping growth in the current system. You have to change the system. If you stop growth in a growth economy, then it collapses, and then that's just a recession. That's not what degrowth is about. It's also not about saying nothing must grow, which is crazy, right? Obviously things have to grow and change. So it's not about that either. It's very much, the point is about economic growth being highly problematic and the energy and throughput of that economy being highly problematic. So degrowth is a provocative political confrontational term. For me, it kind of builds out of the limits to growth, which was also very confrontational to the system and was not easy to co-opt. The idea is that it's not a co-optable or easily co-optable phrase or concept or term. So degrowth is a rallying point, I think, for alternative and radical green criticism, and it can pull in lots of different aspects of those critiques. So, as Yorgos Kallis says, it's an umbrella word, a multifaceted framework that gives purpose and connects different policies and citizens' initiatives. Sorry. So addressing the social crisis is one part of this. Changing social interactions, creating communities, not collections of millions of individuals. The whole point of the kind of liberal, neoliberal position is to actually individualize people, to keep them separate. Because if people are separated and individual, then we can get them to compete with each other, and they can also be kept under control. It's much easier to do. But what we really want is we want to have promote cooperation, create or recreate norms of behaviour about care, sympathy and respect for others. And respect for others means the other is human and non-human. So a range of possible changes I could just throw out, right? We don't have a lot of time today. So, there's all sorts of things that could be done in terms of economic interactions. Making work more meaningful, less dehumanizing, like those factory pictures I showed. Nationalizing basic services like energy, water and railways, take them away from the multinational corporations. Provide public housing, introduce maximum minimum wages, reclaiming common property ownership, and deconstructing the modern corporation, right? Taking away, they've only been around around in their modern form for 100 years, and they need to have their legal status changed, their unlimited liability taken away, and removing their standing in courts as individuals, which is a pernicious thing that came about due to the Americans. What else needs to change? Well, energy production and use, capital-labour relationships, communications, transportation, food production, and what is produced for whom and how. Of course, I've only got minus 30 seconds to do this, but we'll see what I can get in the last bit. A social ecological economy, a scientific utopia, okay? That's what we're looking for. And there's a few speculative ideas. Some implications, right, if we take a few of those points I mentioned, material and energy throughput, one idea is switching to renewable energy, right? Because it moves to an alternative low entropy source away from fossil fuels. But renewable energy alone is not an answer. You have to look at the system and think about what the materials and energy are that are going to be coming into the supply chain. How is it going to be connected? What's happening right now with the green economy is it's being pushed into the standard same system, so it's going to be feeding into a massive grid system. And there's no real thought about the minerals and resources that are going to be used to actually support this system. So there's a whole issue around minimising material and energy demand, not maximising supply. Currently the message is that we can just increase the energy supply and have more and more energy. Changing the capital-labour relationships. Part of this issue here is that there's a discussion about how we can reduce work time in a new green economy. Or if we go to the degrowth, there's still a discussion about how we can have less work time. Actually, I think that once you get rid of fossil fuels, you increase the costs of machinery. Machinery becomes less viable anymore, and you have to actually replace it with labour. So I think the future is actually going to be a return of labour-intensive production. So rather than having less labour, we're going to have more labour. The bias towards capital that has been around with the fossil fuel economy is going to disappear. Then we have changing the density of human population. People are moving into cities, right, on a massive scale. Cities, on the left-hand side, are only sustainable through massive amounts of resource energy being put into them to keep them going, which is transferred across, multinational boundaries. What should be the maximum size of the settlement? How do we think about that? Are cities no longer viable? If cities are no longer viable, this is a major problem for the way human society is going. Should we go to eco-villages? Should they be high-tech or low-tech? What density should you have? And so on and so forth. Lots of questions. What about communications? If we get rid of fossil fuels and the military technology that has supported the whole of the modern communication systems, all those mobile phones that probably most people in the room have, this is you're going to get rid of the satellites. You're actually going to get rid of this whole system that has been set up. So the end of satellites, which go only launched by massive fossil fuels, the end of satellite navigation systems, the end of mobile phones, which use rare metals, and so on. And just to end that a little bit, I'll show you this picture. This is a picture from the European Space Agency of the satellites that are currently buzzing around the Earth. The whole planet is surrounded by a metal shield of satellites now, the space debris and satellites. So, conclusions. Basically, the green growth is traditional economic growth. It's the superficial green trimmings around a continuing economic growth model, with the system unchanged and capitalism unchanged. Faith remains in the kind of utopian vision of ever-expanding happiness. So you change GDP to happiness, it makes no difference. So a lot of people are onto this happiness indexing. It's still a hedonistic, pleasure-seeking world for humans. So we need an alternative utopian vision. Gross social inequity and stability are not going to be addressed by green growth. It's just going to continue on. The resource supply chains have to be there, the people have to be exploited, and the resources have to be extracted to maintain this globalized competitive economy. And the real competition in this economy is military might. So the military is heavily linked into this whole idea of the macroeconomics. And economists in their macroeconomics never discuss the military-industrial complex. They never talk about the link of the military and the technology, or they never talk about what competition means in terms of this leadership race. The leadership race is a military leadership race as well. So the social, ecological, economic future that I would like to see is a call for a radically different economics and society, rethinking growth, consumerism and capital accumulation, prioritising social inequity, poverty and injustice, redistributing and balancing power within a democracy or democratic political system, rejuvenating democratic institutions and processes, articulating environmental values in their broadest sense, respecting nature rather than regarding it as just a resource to be exploited. So to finish, I'll just mention one thing. The Paris conference, the real concern of the elite in Paris, I think can be summarised in these few words. In the long term, if climate change is not tackled, growth itself will be at risk. That was the concern in Paris.
So I will collect the questions and we'll ask you.
Okay.
Profesör Spash'e sormak istediğiniz sorular varsa alabilir.
If you have any questions to Professor Spash, we can take them and I will direct the questions to him. Are there any questions to Professor Spash?
Evet Sevgi. We have one question.
Okay.
Bu kaybedenler, kazananlar konusunda gerçekten
About winners and losers.
özellikle şu güç krizi sonucunda kazananları da etmeye başladığını görüyoruz.
The losers are now threatening the winners, especially after the power wars. And how can you interpret the migration flows and how can you connect it with the degrowth concept?
Green Thought Association. She is asking about the concept of winner and losers. She says, in this concept, when we compare their situation, where we can put the refugee issues, the migration issue, under the concept of winners and losers and their comparison, and also degrowth.
So where do we put the migration issue or the refugees? Basically part of the competitive outcome of the resource wars that we're heading towards. So what's going on and has been on for a long time in the Middle East is to secure oil supplies. And it's the same thing in South America. The United States has been manipulating governments for a long time, and people have been displaced and become migrants and become refugees. I mean, in terms of what's happening now, is just, I see systems being destabilized, they have to be collapsed. America has a massive military. The other countries, Russia has a massive military. What's the point of having a massive military if you don't use it? There's no point, right? So when you get things like massive arms build-ups in the military system, they want to use those weapons. From a straightforward standard economic position, investing millions and billions in weapons that you don't use is a waste of time. So every now and again they're going to have wars to secure their positions. So there's always going to be more migrants, and this is the way the system is operating. So in this system of race for leadership, it's a continuous process of displacement of people, of not caring about people, and of controlling people and pushing them around. And how long can Europe, for example, as people flood across its boundaries, maintain this myth that it's not responsible? It's not responsible for what's going on, and it's directly responsible because of the system that we have, which requires the resources to be exploited from these countries that have to be controlled. So there's a real link in there, I think, to this whole winners-losers leadership race. I'm not sure what will the question linked to degrowth. How is that?
Let me clear. Sevgi, degrowth'la bağlamı...
şeyin de tartışmalarında yeri var mı diye.
She says that refugees as a threat to Europe, as a threat to current growth system, where we can put the refugee issues in also in the degrowth debates as a threat for the growth.
Yeah, well, I mean, ideally, people don't like to basically be displaced in the first place, right? So the problem is with the system, the way the system is set out, what's happening, forcing people out of their lands. I mean, people have been displaced in hundreds of millions in India and in China. For other reasons, they're being displaced to create the growth economy. They're being pushed off their land in rural areas. So land grabbing going on in Africa as well, with China and various other countries investing there. So it's not a matter of dealing with the end point, which is the people flooding into Europe. It's a matter of dealing with the problems at their source, which is why we're creating a system which requires people to be displaced and treating them the way they are treated. Violation of human rights continuously done. And one of the breakdowns of the system is the breaking of the multilateral kind of mindset that came out of the Second World War. The Second World War, the displacement of people, the mass murders and so on, led to the nations getting together, the setting up of the United Nations, because they didn't want it to happen again. What's happened since 9/11 is the United States has, as a matter of foreign policy, broken the multilateralism of the Second World War and has heavily pushed unilateralism. It has violated human rights itself. It has broken international treaties. It has pushed the Canadians out of the Kyoto Agreement, for example, so that it could have more fracking. So the system has collapsed. These independently negotiated targets in the climate agreement are just one indicator of the kind of world that we have. So the degrowth world, the counter to this, is to actually maintain some level of sustainability for people and for a life in which they could live locally. Of course, then you wouldn't be displaced. You would actually break down the systems that is actually requiring this exploitation of resources, the transportation of resources across country boundaries, the colonial model of development that has been set up since the 1600s. Is to break that, to stop it. The problem, of course, is that we have two issues here. One is the utopian vision of the alternative society where you wouldn't have the migrants because you wouldn't have the race and the military-industrial complex and the massive transport of the resources. That's the vision. The problem is the world in which we live, because even if one nation were to go down the degrowth route and to set up its economy that way, it would be under threat from these military nations that are around. The Chinese, the Russians, the Indians, the Americans, the British, the Australians, whoever, right? Yeah. Who have their military and are prepared to use it. So it's getting this, I think right now, is on the agenda. I'm trying to link the military into a realization that the military is linked directly into our macroeconomics. It is part of this rhetoric of competition. It is an integral part of this economic and political structure that we have today, but it's never discussed like that. It's discussed as separate things. We have security issues and we have the economy, but the two are interlinked.
Professor Spash, we have another question. Bağlantı gitti.
And we lost connection.
Tekrar bağlantıyı sağlayalım. Sen soru sor. Olur mu Ahmet?
Hello.
Hello.
I've lost you for a
Sorry,
second.
we have one more question.
Okay.
Evet Ahmet. Tabii. Evet, şuradan. Bilgisayar.
Degrowth hareketi ısı artışını 21. yüzyıl
Well, there's the pledge to keep temperature increase at 2 degrees, maximum 2 degrees by the end of the century. Can the degrowth movement contribute to this pledge? And if not, what should be changed so that degrowth can be a solution for this imminent question or problem?
From İstanbul Technical University, he is one of our speakers. He's asking, can degrowth be a solution for 2-degree goal? Can degrowth provide this actually?
Well, it seems to me that there's not much else that can provide it. You certainly can't provide it if you're in a growth economy. If you look at the growth economy and the way that that operates, it's essentially tied into the fossil fuel economy. We've built the whole economy around the exploitation of fossil fuels. So if you start going out of that model, then of course you're immediately going to start addressing this kind of problem with the carbon throughput, the energy and material throughput that we have. So how else could you address it? There is no other way to address it but to stop the capital accumulating economy. The myth here is this idea that we can have an economy that creates value or well-being or happiness or meaning or something which doesn't have material and energy throughput and is the same growth economy. And the economy is essentially a capitalist system of accumulation. It doesn't matter whether it's in Russia or China or India or wherever it is. It's the same system. So there is no way that you can make that system, that green growth economy, compatible with reducing the material energy throughput. Miraculous technologies are supposed to come along and save us, right? Carbon capture and storage. Even in your wildest dreams, it won't make much of a dent in the throughput of the fossil fuel economy and the greenhouse gases that are going up there. The current thinking is about we're going to invest tremendous quantities of money in what? In renewable energy, as if renewable energy doesn't have infrastructure, materials, doesn't require fossil fuels to actually build it in the first place. You know, there's no way that this system can be constructed without the fossil fuels it has. So you have to tackle the actual demand for this stuff, the demand for the materials and energy, and that means tackling the growth economy. The logic of it is that we, by accelerating throughput, are better off. And yet we know by accelerating throughput we're actually worse off, right? So we end up with more and more stuff that people don't really want and don't really need. You have to create fashion society. You have to create products that don't last. Occasionally you have to have wars where you can wipe out tremendous amounts of materials in a very short period of time so you can rebuild it and recreate it. And, you know, the whole system is quite insane. But so, you know, does degrowth address the 2 degrees? Nothing else really does. If you don't address the growth economy, you're not going to address the 2 degrees. And then we're beyond 2 degrees. We exceeded 2 degrees of CO2 equivalent 3 years ago. It's not in the headlines. COP doesn't talk about it. And if you look at those figures that are coming out, we're going to hit 2 degrees. What probabilities do they give you? Have you seen any probabilities in any of the statements coming out of Paris? And yet when you look at the IPCC reports on which this is supposedly informed by science, they all have probabilities. The COP was heading for a 50-50 chance through their mechanisms and their plans, a 50-50 chance of hitting 2 degrees. Right? They don't mention this now, do they? What probability are they giving us now? Toss the coin and see what we get. And that 50-50 chance in the IPCC reports required carbon capture and storage, an unproven technology that doesn't actually exist on any industrial scale today. That would be required, or we'd have to go back in a time machine to get back to an earlier time when we had lower emissions. I mean, no one's got the time machine and no one has carbon capture and storage, so Paris is a joke, right? I mean, 1.5 degrees, why didn't they say 0 degrees? It makes just as much sense, right? Perhaps 0 wasn't believable enough, you know?
Başka soru var mı salondan? 2 sorumuz daha var. We have 2 more questions. Pınar ve siz.
Benim sorum, şimdi bu silahlanmayı ve askeri makroekonomiyle ilişkilendiriyoruz.
Silahlanmayı ve askeri savunmaları well, you relate armament and security issues with macroeconomies, and on the other hand we have the nuclear issue. There are nuclear weapons and they are used as tools of defense. They're used in the military.
Nükleer enerjide fosil yakıt aslında başka proseslerinde üretilecek.
And in terms of climate change, nuclear energy is also very effective. This is how we know it. But there are those who claim that nuclear energy is a clean way of generating energy. How are we going to overcome this dilemma? So, on the military side, there's the use of nuclear weapons. There's a lot of money spent on it. But on the other hand, when it comes to climate change, nuclear energy can be considered as a fossil fuel as well. How are we going to make the separation?
Anti-nuclear movement, she's a journalist, asking the question that you linked the growth issue with militaristic issues, and also she is mentioning about nuclear weapons, and also she says nuclear energy, which is claimed that is clean energy, but itself in the process produce carbon, so it is fossil based actually. It's a contradiction, and what is the way out from this contradiction, she says?
Okay, well, nuclear was developed primarily as a military weapon. It wouldn't exist today if we hadn't had the Second World War. It was a massive push to get an atomic bomb. And the nuclear power stations that were set up initially, for example, in the United Kingdom, were mainly there to produce weapons-grade plutonium. I met a guy years ago who said that they had never had an efficient nuclear power station run because the military would keep turning up to take the core out of the reactor so they could get more weapons-grade plutonium. So there's always been a strong link between nuclear power and the military. It also, in the 1970s, when we had debates about nuclear power, and there was a massive campaign against nuclear power stations, at that time, one of the concerns was the way in which nuclear requires a security and military society. Nuclear power stations are extremely dirty and dangerous. I mean, if they melt down. If anything goes wrong with them, they're very complicated, they're very high-tech, they're not easy to control, and the waste that comes out of them is also extremely, we don't know what to do with it. Stick it in a big hole in the ground, that's the kind of, it's still got the same logic today. Find a big hole and stick it in there and forget about it. So it's really problematic, but transporting nuclear rods and nuclear materials around the country was then seen in the 70s as when we're going to have a security society. Well, we've got the security society now, so it fits in better today than it did in the 70s, because you've got the military everywhere and you've got the police and the control. So it's very problematic. The point is that to prevent nuclear is even harder now since this latest Paris thing, because they're going to push it really hard now, because it's seen as a proven technology, it's seen as available and so on and so forth. But again, the main reason that it's going to be pushed is because it actually will aid the kind of military-industrial complex that already exists, the companies and corporations that control these high techs, the ones that are already linked in with the military and already have these kind of systems. So I think it's part of the same issue, and it's really those kinds of technologies are the things that need to be pinpointed as the kind of technologies which are extremely problematic and dangerous. They're dangerous at different levels, right? Just environmentally because of the waste, but also socially because of the type of society they create. This controlled, authoritarian, militaristic, secret society, which allows various branches of government and services, military services, to make excuses about why they need to do things, why they need to have areas cordoned off, why they have to control things, why you can't have freedom of information, because of the dangerous technologies that they're employing that people can't know about and can't be controlled. So I see this, as the kind of opposite extreme as a degrowth kind of world, where you would have appropriate technologies which are low-tech, which are manageable, which don't require aerospace technology and military security and so on and so forth, because they're not dangerous. The reason that you have all these pernicious aspects of nuclear is because it's highly dangerous stuff, and it's uncontrollable, right? Anything goes wrong, you get a meltdown. One of the pipes breaks, you get a meltdown. The number of accidental releases in the highest technology states in the world is unbelievable.
Yeah. We have one more question. Bu salondan aldığımız son soru, zaten süreyi çok aşmış durumdayız. Bu yüzden
Well, this will be the last question.
Konuşmacılarınızı tekrar davet edeceğim. Sizin sorunuzu alacağız ve ardından forum kısmı.
And then we will continue with the forum because we're running out of time. Your statements about green economy are quite clear, and I'm very pleased to hear them, because recently there was the Paris conference and we've been talking about climate change. In Eastern Black Sea region, there's this project to construct a motorway which will extend 2,600 kilometers. But it's going to kill the environment in the Black Sea region. We resisted to that for 50 days in the village, and we managed to stop the construction of the road for 50 days actually. That was back in June, May. But this program is backed up by UNDP as well and the government as well. So could you please tell if you could support us in our resistance against this construction?
Yeşil Yol, called Yeşil Yol project. Yeşil Yol is a European Union project done by Turkish Development Ministry. It is a project that will destroy in a long way of forest, north forest of the country. So it's a huge debate under the construction debate. He says that where we can put that kind of project, actually this project in degrowth debate, and also how we can get even an academic support for that kind of resistance.
Can you turn on your camera, by the way? Because I can't see anybody right now. But
Yeah, you can.
I think that this is one of these issues that is also around development of land use
Can you
change.
see now?
Not yet.
Yeah, I turned in. Görüyor musun?
I'll answer the question while you're fiddling with the camera. Okay. I think it's a fundamental issue which links into the way that land use change goes on. So nature and a lot of areas are seen as basically... I can see now, thanks. A lot of areas are seen as basically up for grabs. Nature is not productive enough. It doesn't give a high enough return. We have to invest. Land area is seen as wasted if it's not used. This is an old kind of myth that goes back, way back to the 1600s or earlier, that you have to improve land. You have to take land into the economic systems, into human systems, and you have to actually do something with them. So there's a kind of fundamental mentality that lies behind this, which is about the use of land and its development. Land not used by humans is a waste. It's a wasteland. That's the way it's talked about. Even land that has pollution dumped all over it is not a wasteland. That's a good use, right? Because we're using it for something. So you have this problem with the mentality. The European Communities Development Funds, then, and its infrastructural funds and so on, is literally about this kind of thing. We've got to invest in things to get rates of return. This is one of the biggest problems. I mean, to link into the academic debate, one of the biggest issues that is what's going to be happening now again with the Paris and the other movements that push towards the green economy, is to convert natural areas into capital. Once you have natural capital, what you're talking about is rates of return on investment. What that means is, if your trees don't grow fast enough, they don't give a high enough rate of return. So chop them down. Plant something that grows faster. Put in housing estates, put in factories, whatever. You replace the infrastructure of nature with something that humans can get financial returns out of. And the financial returns, of course, are limited and for limited time periods because the system's not sustainable. So the system won't last. But who cares, right? Because the discount rates are so high, the financial and banking sector don't care. They have no vision of the future. They're only concerned about how much money they're going to make in the short term. Most of those guys are looking forward to getting a few million out of the system and retiring. And the really rich guys to get some billions out of it and retire, and then they'll endow some charity afterwards to say how sorry they were that they screwed the world over. And then they'll have a charity named in their name, like the Bill Gates Foundation. Thank you very much. Here's some pennies for you guys. I'm doing very well, thank you. I'm one of the richest people in the world. There's that kind of a picture. So the land use change issue, though, links directly into the academic concerns about the conceptualization of human nature relationships, of society-nature relationships, of the development projects, right? What is development? Development is not growth. Development is not investing for rates of return for finance. So deconstructing these ideas and these concepts, the point is that the way that the world has been conceptualized is totally unreal. It's surreal. So you change the objects of the world into economic concepts like capital, and nature is not capital. Capital is capital, right? I mean, you convert it into capital, so you can now incorporate it into an economic system that basically wants to destroy it and extract what it can for a minority, not for a majority. So there's very strong links, I think, between the concerns that you have for the destruction of forested areas and conversion into whatever it might be, whether it's industrial agriculture, housing estates, factories, whatever. It's part of the same problem. It's the way that the conceptualization of the world is happening. The big part is that nature and society are being taken over by a market economy system. And the rhetoric of that system is dominating, and the conceptualization is dominating.
Thank you, Professor Spash. Now I'm closing the camera. I want to remind everybody that Professor Spash is not here because that he doesn't want to make large carbon footprints. He only traveled the places that he can take the train, and also I thank him in private especially for that also. And there is a campaign that I want to remind that everybody please consider your travels by the plane according to the carbon footprint. And there is no more question from the saloon.
Can I just say one thing on that? It's not just carbon footprints. If you look at the way that airplanes are, they're part of the military industrial complex, right? Jet planes only exist because they were developed at the end of the Second World War. And if you look at the military industrial complex, jet planes and flying is part of all those companies that make the jet planes also make fighter planes and fighter jet planes, and the technologies are exactly the same.
Yeah, definitely. We agree.